for making it along today. I hope that you'll find this webinar intriguing at the least, perhaps inspiring, hopefully thought-provoking. This seminar is part of World Parks Week, which is led by World Urban Parks, who are one of the sort of critical partners in a consultation that we've been having around this concept of there being national park cities around the world. And World Urban Parks have set this challenge of this idea of there being 25 national park cities around the world by 2025. So this is an idea that came about 6 years ago. I'm going to take you through the idea in this seminar, talking specifically about the experiences and the campaign work that we've been doing in London. But while I'm going to be talking quite enthusiastically about London, I'm sure that you'll be able to identify and relate some of the experiences and issues and opportunities wherever in the world you are as well. Many of them are common, I think, to the human condition. And I'm going to end the presentation by talking about a document that we're consulting on called a Universal Charter for National Park Cities, which is essentially trying to come up with a bit of a template, bit of inspiring positioning document to encourage other people to think about if their city could be a national park city, what that might look like and how it might work. And we're really keen over the next week to hear any voices from any experience or expertise to help us develop that piece of work. So I'm going to start off by just walking you through where this idea really came about from. So my background is I'm a former high school geography teacher. I'm a National Geographic explorer. I'm interested in how we think about places, how we create places, and how we can make places better. About 7 years ago now, I was very privileged to be doing a project with my 10-year-old son at the time, where we visited all of the UK's inspiring, distinctive, remarkable, important, and beautiful national parks in a really short period of time. And I think these are fantastic places. National parks aren't without their problems. They're not all brilliant all the time, but I think they are, as many people say, one of the best ideas that have come out of humanity, despite some of the problems that they've had. And when we think of national parks, quite often we might think of environments a bit like this. So this is Dartmoor National Park in the far southwest of the United Kingdom, which is a moorland. Or this here is Banff National Park in Canada. And when people think of national parks, they quite often think of, I think, these expansive or inspiring environments where they get a sense maybe of adventure or of wilderness. And I think that the way we feel about these places is important, but they're not the only values that these landscapes give us. And when you look at the family of protected areas around the world, every single major type of terrestrial habitat and landscape and marine environment is represented within this body of national parks and protected areas, apart from one, which is a major urban area. And I think that that is problematic on a number of levels, coming purely from the argument of the fact that I think we need a better relationship with nature for our own health and well-being, for the health and well-being of wildlife, and for the health and well-being of the urban fabric itself. So only coming from that perspective, I think there are four main reasons why it's problematic that we don't include major urban areas within the family of national parks worldwide. So firstly, I don't think that urban life is worth less than rural life. I don't think that an urban red fox is worth less than a fennec fox or an Arctic fox. It's just an urban red fox. I don't think an urban peregrine falcon on Tate Modern on the banks of the Thames is worth less than a peregrine falcon at Yosemite or in the Peak District National Parks. It's just an urban peregrine falcon. I think that people deserve great habitats, and the life we share cities with deserve great habitats, just as we might fight for orangutans or for rhinos in other landscapes and environments around the world. Many people think of national parks as places not just for nature, but actually places that they can go and enjoy and be interested and excited by. And I love exploring deserts and rainforests and coral reefs and mountains, but I also enjoy city environments too. they're very different, but I don't think they're any less enjoyable or any less valuable. And finally, when people think of nature conservation, I think there's this idea that on the whole, it's something that's done by an expert person in some distant place, probably in an exotic location with some large charismatic species. Whereas the place where most people in the world have power around these issues is actually where they live, where most people are, in cities. It's where people have most agency over flower pots and balconies and gardens and streets and the local parks. But also thinking beyond the urban footprint itself, it's people in cities who are, on the whole, making the decisions through their consumption power, through the constituencies that they create through politics, that actually have a larger footprint on the planet as a whole. So for all these reasons, I don't really think that it makes sense to exclude or alienate urban people from this vital agenda, which is about all of nature, including us, for the entire planet. I don't think that an urban environment is worth more necessarily or less necessarily than a desert or a rainforest or a coral reef. It's just different. And I think it's problematic we exclude these environments. Based on that thinking, I asked myself a question a few years ago: could London become a national park? And even for myself, I dwelled on this for about 6 months. I thought to myself, this is quite possibly a ridiculous idea. And I asked different people what they thought. And on the whole, when I spoke to people about this idea, whether it took a minute or an hour or a week or a year, people would have aha moments about why this might make sense. Largely because I think the wealth of evidence around why we need to have a better relationship with nature has really caught up with this idea. But it may seem like a ridiculous idea when you see an image like this, looking from the top of Barbican, in central looking south across London, because many people will think of London perhaps as a very grey, concrete city. But the reality is that London is one of the greenest cities in the world for its size. It's at least 47% physically green, another 2.5% blue, so that's the rivers, the canals, the ponds, the nature reserves, the woodlands, the gardens, covering the city. And the city is that green because of centuries of top-down policy from central government, regional government, local government, by the City of London Corporation, by the royal family, and royal families going back through time, protecting spaces. But also the actions of literally millions of people over hundreds of years, taking grassroots actions in their gardens, in their local parks, on their streets, to contribute towards this landscape that we have today. So this here is a national nature reserve. It's Richmond Park, which is in southwest London. And this is just one example of one of the great parks that we have in the city. This now is looking in South London, looking over towards North London. And what you see here is a mosaic of different types of land that are being protected by different types of groups. So to the bottom right of the image, there's a metropolitan open space, a park called Crystal Palace. Just above that, going deeper into the woodlands, there's Dulwich Woods, which is a private woodland. Then deeper into the woods still, there's Sydenham Woods, which is managed by the London Wildlife Trust. Then up to the top of a hill, and you're in a place called the Horniman Museum, with one of the best views across London, which is a cultural space. And then just below that, there's Nunhead Cemetery, which is one of the oldest cemeteries in London, where there are endangered beetles, great views across the city. And surrounding that is this mosaic, this patchwork of habitats of private gardens, private land spaces and public spaces that contribute to the landscape. This square that you see right in the middle of the frame is a place called Mudchute City Farm. This is a place where you can photograph sheep, and in the background you can pick up Canary Wharf, which is to the right of the image, where there's some of the highest property prices in the world, where Barclays Bank and other big banks are based. And by international standards, I think this is quite a remarkable image, because not only do we have the River Thames in its wildness snaking around what is nearly an island in what is called the Isle of Dogs in the middle of the frame, but actually we've managed to protect somehow these green spaces right next door to some of the highest property prices in the world, which culturally, politically, the fact we've achieved that, I think, is really, really worth celebrating and championing. But for me, some of the most exciting spaces are actually people's private gardens. There are about 3.8 million gardens in London. And these are spaces where people have the power not just to protect life, but actually create life by pulling back the tide on pesticides and concreting the city. And I'm going to come back to that again later. But while people's experience of a rural national park is one primarily probably as a consumer, where you pay your tax dollars and you go and visit that place and you might contribute some soil erosion and you enjoy that place. You're probably not going to contribute to that place as a volunteer. So what's very different about the idea of a national park that covers an entire city is you have millions of people who are not just consumers of that space, but actually they can be contributors and detractors, but contributors to that space as well. So the result of having all these different types of lands in London is that we actually have an incredible amount of diversity of life in the city. So Green Space for Information for Greater London has got records showing that there is up to 15,000 species of life in London alongside Homo sapiens that have been recorded. In this case, you can see this lovely badger making its way through a fence. Now, that's not to say that the city is bliss or amazing for all life. It's clearly hostile for a lot of life. But there's some animals that are thriving in cities, and there's some animals that are doing much better in the city than in the countryside. And, that's the case, despite the fact that actually people are often quite hostile towards wildlife in cities. Here we've got some wagtails in the side of a building beside a river. And that life is there despite the fact that we don't have any policies, particularly in the city, which maybe, for example, insist on designing habitats into the side of buildings and into the landscape itself. But London, like many cities, isn't just good for some species of wildlife. Actually, it's pretty good for recreation and sport and culture as well. So there are 50 canoe clubs in London. There's loads of rivers and waterways, and it's pretty amazing for walking as well, because the city itself is incredibly connected. It's got great public transport, and it's very porous. So as a result of all those things, more people are walking and running in our cities, not just because there are more people in cities, but because they are so much more accessible than large parts of the countryside. And these maps sort of demonstrate that, I guess, in a way. This is a Strava map showing where people are cycling in the United Kingdom. The places which are glowing brightest are our cities. And then here is another map looking at walking. So a lot of the activity that's happening in terms of recreation and running and getting about is taking place in cities as well. So London by numbers is quite a remarkable place. There are as many trees as people. Some people have argued that London is the most species-rich region of the UK. I think that's a contested idea, but it's certainly a case can be made for that. There are 4 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, 1,400 sites of importance for nature conservation, and I could go on. So I think that the thing about a national park is it's partially about celebrating what's fantastic about a landscape and what's worth protecting. But fundamentally, the reason why we have national parks is because they face existential threats, because they have problems to overcome as well, whether that's poaching, hunting, encroachment of settlement, types of pollution or threats from mining. But the fact that those problems are there, the fact that there's problems with gorillas being poached in Virunga or pangolins in Kruger, or the fact that there's other kinds of problems happening in national parks elsewhere in the world, aren't reasons for them not to be national parks. In my mind, they're the very reason why we need the national park, in order to help protect those places. So a London National Park City as an idea is in part about celebrating those things that have been done by so many institutions and individuals and civic society to create the landscape and the culture that we have in the city, and celebrating all that stuff that's great, but also recognizing some problems and some pains. So actually I could spend a long time talking about a lot of problems that London faces, but I'm just going to touch on a few. So for starters, and this is an experimental film I made walking from South London to North London. What you're seeing is, if the video is quick enough for you, the tree canopy above as I take a photograph every 3 seconds. And on this walk that took me a day from one side of London to the other, I saw all kinds of wildlife, woodpeckers, deer, foxes, snakes, but I did not see any children playing in any of the woods. So then I did a project with Centre for London, a think tank here in London, and went looking for wildlife and people in an area of ancient woodland in southeast London, a big area of woodland and park. The only children who were outside in those woods were with parents who were also walking dogs. So in the UK, research by Natural England, which is a government agency that deals with national parks and nature in the UK, well, in England, has found that 1 in 6 children in London haven't been to a green space with their parents at all in the last year. So good news is that 5 and 6 have. 5 and 6 are either going once in a while, or they're playing football, or they're doing nature awards, but 1 and 6 aren't. A good number of those other 5 and 6 will only be going occasionally. And this has a cost for their mental health, for their well-being, for their development, for their likelihood to go on, I think, and care for nature in the future and be a constituent for wanting to look after green spaces in the future. But it has a cost for society as well. So Vivid Economics, an economics team that worked for the Greater London Authority and the Mayor's team here in London, found that every year London's public green spaces saved 950 million in health costs and 370 million as a result of better mental health. I should say 370 million rather than 370. So, not only is there a cost to the individual by people not accessing these green spaces and nature as much as they could do, but there's a very real societal and economic cost as well. Not just people. So hedgehogs are having a really hard time in the UK at the moment. For every one of these really charismatic, beautiful species, there's probably 1,000 ugly ones that people don't know about or don't particularly care about. And it's estimated at the moment that 1 in 10 species in the United Kingdom is at risk of extinction. 1 in 5 mammals is at risk of extinction. And this is set to the backdrop of, in my lifetime, the total number of wild animals on the planet, it's been estimated by WWF, has halved. And it's not just the wildlife facing these problems. So it's been estimated that 10,000 Homo sapiens die as a result of air pollution every year here in London. Who knows how many domestic and wild animals are dying early because of air pollution. And so it's not just wildlife that's under threat, but it's us as animals as well. Another problem. So about a quarter of London, 24% of London is domestic gardens, about 3.8 million gardens in total. But these gardens now, about half of them are now paved over. And this paving in gardens reduces the amount of bioabundance, so the amount of wildlife in the city, the biodiversity, so the range of wildlife in the city. It increases the chances of flooding. The runoff that we do get that isn't flooding or is flooding that goes into our Victorian sewers increases the overall bill for water management within the city. At the moment, under the River Thames, we have a super sewer being built at the cost of a number of £1 billion. Now, it's been estimated that we need another one of those in 50 years' time if we don't invest properly in green infrastructure, which doesn't have to necessarily be very expensive or very complicated. But the costs of not having these interventions in green infrastructure, not only about wildlife's health and well-being and the fabric, like I say, but also human health as well. So it used to be that a lot of people would die in the United Kingdom as a result of cold winters. Well, now actually, along with the urban heat island, which is exacerbated by there being less green space in the city, partially results in there being more deaths in the summer than the winter time now in the UK. So we've estimated through the campaign that if every Londoner was to make 1 square metre of the city green or blue, we'd make the majority of London green or blue. And this 50% target that we have is not really an end point. It's just the first point of ratcheting up an effort to turn the tide on grey beating green so that we start reversing that. But also because that target is something that the Mayor of London can't achieve on his own, councils can't achieve on their own, property developers can't achieve on their own, and individual residents can't achieve on their own. But on average, by everyone working together, it's completely possible to imagine more than half of London becoming green and blue. Another problem, this here is something called the All London Green Grid, which is a bit of fantastic project work done by a number of organisations led by the Mayor of London's environment team, looking at green infrastructure in London and thinking about how across different parts and watersheds of London, the city can be made greener, better connected, more resilient, better for recreation and other factors. But just consider this for the moment, that while that image looks very complete, it actually doesn't go any bigger than that in terms of being a GIS. And politically, the public sector and charities and different groups tend to get quite fixed on the places where they have power. And so as a result, 2 paragraphs into this document, they explain that they're only going to focus on land that is public land or that the mayor and councils have influence over. So omitting private gardens and private spaces. So when you consider that at least 1/4 of the map you're looking at is private gardens, when you consider that the majority of trees in London are in private ownership. To have strategies which don't look at how to galvanise and inspire the public as a whole to engage in these strategies, I think is a fairly large omission. And so thinking about that even more deeply, this here is a bubble diagram showing the number of species that have been recorded in different boroughs in London. And you can see just to the centre right of the image there, where it says Richmond upon Thames, it looks like Richmond upon Thames, this big borough London, has the largest number of species, and that may be the case. But if you cast your eye over to the far left of the image, you'll see a really small bubble where it says Croydon. So it looks like Croydon has, less than 10% of the number of species that have been recorded in Richmond, or less than 10% the amount of species that there are in Richmond. But what's really going on here is that in Richmond upon Thames, well, that's where David Attenborough lives. And that's where there's lots of retired people with biology degrees, with a lot of time on their hands, who can go out and collect and count lots of insects. As it happens, Croydon is one of the most diverse boroughs in London. It's a very diverse part of the UK. But people there don't have quite so much time, and then maybe they've got different qualifications, and they're not choosing to invest their time in counting insects and other wildlife. So it appears as if Croydon has less going on there. But what's really going on is there's just less investment in this issue or in this theme in London. So there are some organisations in London who will really experience the fact that they're doing great and fantastic work. And indeed, we can do this work in London because there are the institutions, the civic society, the ideas, the spaces. That is why we can push forward on this now. But it is not true that those efforts, that energy, that time, that resource, that education is spread equitably across the city, or that that experience couldn't be shared more. And I could show you a bubble diagram to show other kinds of inequality in London, may it be around mental health or access to nature or risk of flooding, which would also show these inequalities. So although there are some places that are doing brilliantly in the city, it's not that it's the case it's happening everywhere. Then you scale that thinking to equity more globally. So this is a quote from Salzburg Global Seminar that just reminds us that the population of the world moving from between 3.5 billion to 7 billion in 35 years, and that the vast majority of the world's population are going to be living in cities. And that while London is very fortunate, I am very fortunate in a city to have inherited a very green and diverse landscape, many cities around the world are urbanizing and developing very quickly without necessarily having these green spaces, green infrastructure, nature built into them. And so the chances of non-communicable diseases increasing only goes up in these kinds of environments. So just one last problem to center on. There's a very significant problem we face in the world with both the ecological crisis, with the demise of species and bioabundance and biodiversity around the world, but also the climate crisis and potential impending climate catastrophe if we don't act on human-induced climate change. And this diagram here from the World Economic Forum, I think, casts the seriousness into some light, where the World Economic Forum is where presidents and CEOs will often look to for leadership on what's happening around the world. And you can see here that the top set of bars is global risks in terms of likelihood, and then the bottom are the global risks in terms of impact going through the last few years. And as we move from the left to the right of the image, you'll see that it's recognized more and more that the most severe risks and most likely risks to society, to the environment, to us, are environmental ones. Fundamentally, it's the decisions that people make in cities, the places where decisions are made, where people are, where consumers are. It's the places where people are not engaging maybe with nature enough and not necessarily making the decisions that need to be made. It's the cities that are really important to bring about these changes that we need to see to tackle these issues. So, set that backdrop of, does it make sense that we would exclude cities from the family of national parks around the world? There's this question, could London become a national park, that I asked and people started asking 6 or so years ago. And in the UK, London can't become a national park. By law, in England, London can't become a national park. By law, would have to be great for wildlife. Actually, for urban wildlife in parts of the city, it's pretty great, pretty good place, doing pretty well. Could do better, but so could many national parks themselves. Actually, London is brilliant for recreation as well, which is the second criteria. But thirdly, London would have to be countryside. And London is not countryside. Parts of Greater London, you could argue, are countryside, but not the conurbation itself. So London would not fit the bill for a UK national park. It also wouldn't fit the bill for the IUCN definition, the International Union for Conservation for Nature's definition of a national park either. Interestingly, in Scotland, or perhaps the Netherlands, or some parts of the world, a national park needs to be an outstanding landscape. And so a city could potentially be within their framework for what a national park is. In Australia, they say that a national park directly correlates and aligns with the IUCN definition for a national park. So a city couldn't be a national park according to an Australian definition either. So keeping that all in mind and thinking about how cities are different from rural areas, and there's no way in which we wanted to confuse people or dilute such a brilliant idea or be offensive to these rural landscapes that are so important. We got together a group of experts and crowdfunded, developed, co-created a proposal for London to become a national park city. And a national park city is not a national park. It's a new kind of national park that's inspired by national parks, but it's not a national park as you would traditionally think of it. To be honest, I'm not sure that many people would see rainforest or mountains and confuse those landscapes or environments with cities. But the fact that it's called a national park city, I think really marks the fact that it's different. The draft definition that we've worked up is this idea that a national park city is a place, a vision, and a community of people who are looking after that place. Now, when you think of a traditional national park in the United States where the land is owned by the federal government and there are rangers and there are laws and a very, very top-down structure for looking after that place, there's still a community of people who are looking after it and a shared vision for that place. In the UK, we have about 400,000 people who live in our national parks. And the national parks are delivered through partnership, yes, with a national park authority, but there are many people who own the land and cultivate the land and who have wisdom and knowledge for looking after that space. And then there are other protected areas around the world where those national parks are delivered by indigenous people with traditional knowledge, with their own paradigms for looking after those particular spaces. So a national park city in many ways would be about bringing together all these different ideas into one. It's a place you can explore, it's a place you can improve, it's a vision you can share, you can contribute to, that you can dissent from, but it's also a community of people looking after that place. But what makes it so different is the vast numbers of people who live in it, who have the power to contribute towards it, and the fact that ultimately they sleep in it as well, rather than going home at the end of the day. So just like a rural national park, it'd be protected through both formal and informal means. And the key point here being that everyone has the power to contribute towards it within the city itself. So within this lineage of protected areas around the world, and this is a very UK-centred timeline of protected areas. But when you look at this timeline of national parks and protected areas around the world, we do see an emergence of urban national parks kicking in from the 1950s onwards. But whenever we see these urban protected places, they're always beside the city or inside the city, whether it's in Stockholm or Washington, DC with national parks or national park services inside the city, or in Toronto or Rio or Mumbai with urban national parks beside the cities. Nature is always othered, it's always beside. So what the contribution is around the idea of a national park city is that it's the entire conurbation. It's all the buildings, all the houses, all the gardens, all the peregrine falcons, all the free runners, all the skateboarders. Everyone in the city is included. No one is excluded. And the principles about how we can make it a success often already exist in the city. There's already the ideas, the talent, the finance, the spaces to make this a success, especially for where we are in London. But it's that those ideas and those practices aren't being taken up culturally across the city as much as they could do. So where we are, over the last 6 years, we've had Thousands of people contribute to petitions and crowdfunders coming along to large-scale events. We built a network of over 200 organizations, ranging from small groups that love slugs right up to large multinational companies. And we've had political support from across the city, with over 1,000 local politicians, the majority of London's local politicians, and the mayor providing his support as well. And what we said early on was, rather than getting a designation from central government, instead, because a national park city was a new kind of national park, that meant that we could define it for ourselves and we could declare it for ourselves, but the mandate would come through having the support of the majority of local politicians, the mayor of London, and also being able to test the mood of the city and check that the mood of the city is with us through media and through polling. So the London National Park City, as an idea, it's a place, it's a vision and a movement to improve life in London. It's about making the city greener, healthier and wilder, whether that's that you're just taking a bit of time out for yourself to improve your own health, to help, if you just do that for yourself, that would contribute towards the mission, or whether you're doing something more proactive. It's about getting more people outdoors more of the time, enjoying themselves and benefiting from being outdoors, and about shaping a new identity for London and Londoners. Thinking about London as a centre that's not just a political, cultural and financial centre, but an ecological centre too. One that asks what different kinds of decisions might businesses make or councils make when we begin to think of ourselves as a national park city. But also thinking, what might it mean for a 2 or 3-year-old going through school over a number of years, knowing that they live and inhabit a national park city? What ideas might they have in the future? What might they vote for in the future? What decisions might they make that contribute towards this vision if they hold this to their hearts? So a national park city as a principle, it's fundamentally about people. People are the opportunity. They are the strength, the power to making this a success, rather than being a barrier like many people might think people are in cities. The National Park City is driven by culture, by the things that people do in the city. It's inspired by the environment, it's for the environment, but it's fundamentally about what people do. And so I love that there was an article in a news broadcast in Melbourne where they were talking about the idea of a national park city being about weaving nature through the fabric of the city in as many ways as possible. For me, it's about ingraining this idea into the musicians, the storytellers, the artists, the poets. And it's those people who will inspire people to engage with this mission, probably more than the typical person who's trying to protect their local park, as important as they are. Finally, because it's a landscape approach, it's about the landscape and everything in it. It means that we can tolerate good things and bad things. It means everyone is involved, whether they're contributing or detracting towards the vision, which allows more scope for dealing with working with more people in the city than maybe a typical charity might do. So the London National Park City is it's the place, it's the vision, it's the movement. But here in London, in the London context, we've also set up an organisation called the National Park City Foundation, which is a charity which has been established to help make the London National Park City a success, and where appropriate to help other cities follow a similar journey. And really fundamentally what we're trying to do is to grow our constituency, lead campaigns and build support to deliver on the things you can see on the right of this squid-like diagram. So we want more biodiversity, we want more local food growing, we want more wildlife, we want more walking and more cycling. We want more funds to be leveraged into environmental projects. And we're intentionally using this language because if we say we want more wildlife and more walking, then these are, yes, they're things that mayors and councils and people can deliver through policy, but any individual should be able to read the idea that we want more walking and understand that actually they have a role in that mission. So what we're going to be doing on a regular basis is publishing something called the State of the National Park City Report, which is going to be measuring these different indicators and not saying how well the mayor's doing or how well a business is doing or how well our small charity is doing, but saying how well the city is doing on making progress across these different goals. So in terms of our philosophy and a bit on how we are working, every year we're going to be publishing the State of the National Park City Report. Then working with our network, we're going to agree our priorities and an action plan. Then off the back of that, we're going to build partnerships and build capacity. And then we're going to lead as best as possible our network and the movement we're joining towards making progress across these different goals. But this diagram you see at the bottom, which links the foundation to the London National Park City, so the charity, to the place and to the movement, and then maybe people or organisations in those blue spots there. For us, in many ways, success will look like people just getting on and doing stuff amongst themselves. They may or may not know about our charity. They may or may not know about the London National Park City, but they're just doing stuff like putting holes in hedges for hedgehogs or making sure there's more outdoor learning in their schools. And so for me, there are two questions really that underpin our theory of change. And these two questions, I think, sum up what we're all about. And the first one is a what if question. What if being taking people into an ideation space where to the backdrop of the National Park City, people start exploring possible futures. You know, what if we had more otters in our canals? What if we had more stand-up paddleboarding in our canals? What if we had more outdoor learning in schools? And then the next question is about creating a why not question, where people begin to ask, well, why don't we have more otters in our canals? And why don't we have stand-up paddleboarding in our canals? And why don't we have more outdoor learning in schools? And we can see this happening in the past, where maybe 50 years ago in the UK, some parents would move from a question of saying, well, what if my child could go to school and not get hit by a ruler or a bit of bamboo? And you know, what if they could have good maths lessons and good science lessons? And then at a certain point, a critical mass of parents would go into a school, maybe just 3 or 4, and say, you know, would you mind, Mr. Firkins, not hitting my child and delivering a half-decent maths lesson? And that's how we create change. So for me, there's a question there about, well, why don't we have enough recess time in schools? Why don't we have space for children to play on the streets? Why don't we have otters in our canals? And so we build a constituency of people who, to the backdrop of the National Park City and the framing that provides, starts to raise expectations about what we demand from the city. And these changes I'm describing for some people will happen overnight. Some they may never experience at all, but generationally we could experience some really big changes. So some interesting what ifs, why not? We're doing lots of work in London. But the Moxons, some designers, have thought about all the ways in which you could retrofit some Victorian terrace housing for wildlife. You know, what if? Why not? WATM, the architects, had fun thinking about Fleet Street, a big street in London, thinking about what happens if we were to pedestrianise it and make it as green as possible. This here is from Farrell, some architects, thinking about the side of buildings. So often you see the sides of buildings that have no windows on them. What if they were vertical commons where you could go climbing, and if you fall and die, it's on you, it's your fault, just like in the countryside. And that idea, this idea of having giant climbing walls in cities, or giant green walls, or via ferrata going between buildings, kind of sounds ridiculous in a way. It's like this what if that sounds ridiculous. But if you transition to the why not space, well, maybe actually there isn't any good reasons why we shouldn't be doing this, other than the fact that it seems ridiculous. Maybe we should push through on these ideas. We asked, what if we could get the BBC to make a wildlife programme that included the National Park City? And in the US, Nature's New Wild will be on soon, and you'll see the London National Park City feature in that for 10 minutes. We've had lots of different volunteers do all kinds of things for us, but one of the best examples is a guy called Charlie Peel in Hackney in East London, who came to us and said, can we make a map of the London National Park City? This is a map that you can see on screen that's 1 metre squared, so it's a giant map you can pull out showing all the parks, all the canals, all the footpaths and how they join up, showing people for the first time London as a landscape. No one had really seen London like this before. And Charlie, as a volunteered for 600 hours making this map, which has been distributed to thousands of people for free across London, which just shows how with a bit of inspiration and a bit of energy, how you can really get stuff done. We asked, what if we could influence mayoral policy? And not only is the mayor supporting us with officer time and with budgets aligning funding towards grants for helping to green the city, but as well as that policy as well. So this is the London Environment Strategy, which includes this target of making 50% of London green, despite the fact we're fitting more and more people into the city all of the time. And this is a story that's weaving across the world through social media and through some fairly big influences. So 9 in 10 Londoners, we know through a YouGov poll, support our aims. And it's our understanding through that 1 in 20 have volunteered to take action to help us in some way over the last 6 years, which is a large number of people. By the end of this year, we want 9 in 10 Londoners to know about the National Park City and 1 in 10 to have become positively and actively involved in some way. We're doing this in a number of ways. So on our website, we recently launched a Make Life Better campaign, which is fundamentally a very flat campaign, which is about giving people ideas of things that they can do on their balcony, in their streets, in their garden. Some of it's about things like places where you can go walking, but also just, for example, the idea of doing nothing for nature. Just let ivy grow, just give slugs a chance. And just this idea of just leaving it alone and trying to encourage a different aesthetic for maybe what gardens could look like, and recognizing that a feral garden may be a more invested garden than a concrete garden that looks tidier. We have got National Park City makers who are our volunteers who are helping us to bring this to life. And we're developing at the moment a volunteer National Park City Ranger program, which essentially is about finding volunteers who are experts in issues, so problems the city faces, particular places, or in skills that can be given to other people. And these people they're the glue, they're the catalyzers who can connect good ideas from one place to another place where those ideas aren't happening, or where there's maybe a skills shortage. And they're not necessarily just environmentalists. These will be filmmakers, poets, artists, fundraisers who can help people to get work done towards our aims. This July, the London National Park City is launching, with the help of the Mayor of London, with the first National Park City Festival. It's going to be the biggest festival of the outdoors in the UK, with hundreds of events across the capital, and some signature events, including with the National Theatre, getting people onto rooftops, getting people swimming in waterways, a big wildlife photography competition, and so on, with us actually launching on July 22nd. So this idea has started to move around the world, and we wanted to do some work to help that, not because we've necessarily, in the London National Park City, wanted to make it spread around the world. It's more that as we've progressed in our campaign and work, other people have come to us and asked questions. This is a video made by the Minister of Environment for South Australia, who'd like Adelaide to be the next national park city. And World Urban Parks have set down this challenge, this idea of there being 25 national park cities by 2025, which for us, we felt that was quite ambitious, but it was pointed out at a recent consultation event that actually maybe the need around the world is much greater than that, and potentially things need to move more quickly than that, although personally I feel cautious of that agenda. But the point being made that, you know, it's all very well thinking about London and other big cities in the world that have inherited these great landscapes and are fortunate to do so. But, you know, most of the world's people in cities live in much smaller cities with very different types of problems, and like I said earlier, with rapid urbanization as well. So because of that, we're currently consulting on what we're calling a universal charter for national park cities, which is fundamentally about sharing a vision and power, so that people can understand how they can think about national park cities and whether their city could be a national park city and how that might work. So I'm just going to finish talking a little bit about that. So the idea of the Universal Charter for National Park Cities, which we're consulting on, and the consultation ends this Sunday, is fundamentally about inspiring people. It's not about the wiring about how you deliver a national park city. It's not an action plan for how you deliver it. It's about creating a document that can inspire people and give them enough guidance to get involved. There was a large gap between John Muir and others thinking about national parks and then becoming heavily systemized and becoming highly technical in what they were doing. And we think we've got some time to be in an ideation, inspiring space with people before feeling that we have to become super technical while we're still on this learning journey. But this document, we want to work so that it inspires 8 to 80-year-olds, that it can be relevant to families, businesses, and politicians, that some elements will be universal to work for all cities, but others will be city-specific to particular neighborhoods or streets or someone's particular life. That while some elements will be fairly fixed in stone, others will be in motion so that we can iterate and develop and learn as we go. And that really everyone should be able to access it and read it and contribute towards its vision. So if you think about what it might look like in parts, well, parts of it may be a bit like the Magna Carta, essentially being laying down some of the authority and thinking behind this idea. Another part, setting out a set of goals about what it is we're trying to achieve together. And then finally, a section which is far more flexible, perhaps personalizable, where people can get ideas of actions that they can take towards those goals and maybe even reflect on or share what they're planning on doing. So that we see a document that may be only a slide or two, that has a case for support, a vision, a definition, values, characteristics, some goals, and ways to get involved. And it's these elements that we are consulting on. I'm not going to go through all of these now. I'm just going to go a bit deeper into two of these briefly. So firstly, the potential characteristics of what a national park city is. A lot of people have asked us questions about, well, how do you become a national park city? And what would mean that one place could be one and another place may not be one? And we're still working through the answers to some of those questions, because every city is different, and we don't assume that we have all the knowledge or wisdom to be able to answer those questions straight off. But what we're testing in the consultation is the idea that these characteristics of a national park city are that there's 10 of them, that the city is inspired and guided by this document we're creating, the Universal Charter for National Park Cities, that it's a large citywide landscape, that it's a place, a vision, and a community that aims to be greener, healthier, and wilder. That the city includes a number of places and projects and initiatives that residents are proud of. That there's an active civic society and an appetite and a mood and an energy in the city for the key aspects of the national park city. That they can demonstrate the majority of the people in the city support the aims of the national park city, even if that's just through polling or something like that. That there's healthy support from city government and local politicians. Although, it could be that there's a city in the world where actually there isn't city government support, but there's phenomenal local government support or citizen support. And then there might be other cities in the world where actually there might be fantastic government support, and the national park city might be a way of bolstering the civic support. So we don't suppose that a city necessarily meets all of these characteristics. It may be a mixture of them. That they've established a robust and collaborative and healthy network of organisations to help deliver the national park city, which I think is key. That it implements meaningful policies to protect and increase culture and heritage. And finally, that it has identified and is committed to progressing towards the goals that it has identified, as well as some of those in the Universal Charter. And then we've got this long list of goals, which I'm not going to read out now. And we really need to slim these down, maybe to something far closer to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But they need to be more detailed than the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because we're a bit more specific with the National Park City rather than the broadness of the Sustainable Development Goals. But this idea that we're working for more and better language which everyone can understand, clean air, healthy rivers, green volunteering, and so on. We need to narrow these down, and we're looking for advice on that. So we're really hoping that any of you on the call or watching this video afterwards will be interested in responding to this consultation on national park cities. Tell us what you think about it. Is it about right? Is it about right? What works? What doesn't work? What's unclear? What's missing? What should be added? What doesn't really belong in a charter maybe? What might your cause of action be for people in cities? If lots of people in cities were to take this up and start doing things, and to question, could your city be a national park city? And if it was one, what might that mean? So that's the end of the webinar. I realized I've got an English accent and I've spoken quite quickly, but I hope that you found that interesting, and you can see some dates on the screen there, and you can sort of continue the conversation using the hashtags World Parks Week and National Park City. But in the last sort of 8 minutes or so, if anyone has any questions that they'd like to share with me, that would be absolutely fantastic. And was I loud enough? Could you hear me?
Hi, Dan. We could hear you well, and thank you so much. This is very inspiring for me. If anyone has any questions, I'll let other people start first.
If silence means I'm sweeping agreement.
Well, I have a question, Dan. So I was wondering about the goals. Have there been any measurable goals identified for London, such as increasing canopy cover by a certain percentage over so many years, or is this just being loosely talked about at this point?
Yeah, so actually there is this target of making the majority of London green. So you can imagine London looking and feeling greener from the ground, but also when you look at it from space later on. And the mayor has targets around tree canopy cover and that kind of thing. We actually at the moment, the philosophy culturally that we're trying to push forward on is just that we're making progress year on year. And that's a narrative we quite like. We're not really setting targets for ourselves at the moment. That's not within our theory of change. That's not to say that we won't end up, once we're drilling into goals further, we won't end up having some quite technical targets, but the jury's still out on whether or not we necessarily communicate those to the public, because we don't want to make it too technical. We want to create more of a movement, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that other people in other cities and other conditions may feel that, like in Singapore, that targets are a really great way to go to ratchet up, efforts. And so we'd really want to learn from that as well. But at the moment, that's not where our thinking is. Although we recognise that for some things, like I say, like the amount of green space, be useful. Some of them are quite hard. So actually evidencing increases in bioabundance is quite a tricky and expensive thing to do, for example, like across the city. But we would love to be able to prove that we're making progress on that. But to say, for example, we're having 5% more or 10% more of certain things could come across and feel a bit arbitrary. So the jury's out.
Thank you. And for everyone on this call, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, Provalence Learning, and I will include the link here, as well as CEUs if you're interested in that.
Well, I encourage everybody, it'd be really fantastic if you could take a look at the consultation. Other than asking for your name and email at the beginning, everything else is not forced. So, you could potentially go through it and just answer the bits you want to answer, and that's completely fine. And we're really keen to hear from people in different parts of the world. So if you can share it on social media or with your networks, then that would be really fantastic. But even though the consultation ends on May 5th, and then we're planning on having a first draft in July, it's going to be an iterative document. So, we'll go forward from there. But just to say, Hannah, on your question about targets, we're talking with ICLEI, we're talking with the IUCN Urban Alliance, and some of these organizations, we're talking to about other metrics that could be used to support the National Park City and also storytelling and things. So I think that although we don't have other targets ourselves, yes, at the moment, that doesn't mean that we may not align with other people who have targets, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
Hey, Hannah, quick question. Is NRPA looking at this too, or they don't know about it yet?
NRPA?
Yeah, National Park Recreation.
You mean the National Park Service in the US?
No, this will be the National Park Recreation Association, Dan. They're out of Virginia. It's just, they're kind of, there's each state here in the US has its own state organization, and all of them be part of NRPA. But I was just asking Hannah if she's, aware of, has NRPA, latched onto this too, to get Dan, maybe more people to, watch your webinar, at least start getting informed, thinking about this whole prospect idea.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not sure right now how aware NRPA is. We have sent the link to this webinar out to some people, so maybe they'll tune in tomorrow. But I will follow up and see if anyone has heard of it.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
I know that National Park Service is aware, and there's different institutions in the US that are aware. I think it's interesting that my experience of working with people in different countries around the world, my sense is that culturally there might be a sense in the US that the protected areas landscape is already pretty cluttered, and that the identity of a national park is so sacrosanct that there isn't space for this. But all I would say, I don't mean buses in, that's wrong, but in the UK, it's taken 6 years to get to where we are now, and we're still having conversations. So as a concept, it's an ongoing conversations for people to have these aha moments and to get it if they are going to get it. And that'd be the case in Australia, the US, wherever. So although there might be some people who at first light don't understand the idea, on the whole, my experience is that once there's a quality conversation, actually there tends to be quite a bit of excitement around it, but the conversation is necessary. For me as an educator, I see that as a plus, because actually we face a number of problems in the world, and going through that journey of thinking about how we break down some of these boundaries, in my mind, is a positive challenge to have, even though it's a challenge.
No, I would agree, Dan. Yeah, us here in the United States, yeah, everybody's got their little fiefdom, and all this, and yeah, you start mentioning national parks and all this, and people get the impression of what national park is here in the United States. But you bring in your discussion today, you bring up a completely different scenario of what maybe a national park city could look like, and I'm open to that here in the United States. That's starting to have those discussions here.
Fantastic. And with anyone on the call, like if beyond this call, you want to drop me an email, you're very welcome to do so. If you email the London National Park City website and just say to Dan, then it will come through to me. So feel free to do that if you feel it's appropriate. But thank you all for your time this afternoon.
Hey Dan, just quick, how will we all that are around this webinar be able to get a draft one, or do we have to request that?
You mean for the PDF of the presentation?
No, your draft one that's coming out on July 21st.
Yeah, so if you go to the National Park City Foundation website where the consultation is,
yep,
and sign up to the newsletter.
Okay.
And we'll do that, and yeah, that'd be the best way to do it. And
okay.
You'll see there's opportunities there to potentially have comment on a first, like the next iteration as well.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Dan, there was a comment that came in from Paige, said, great presentation. I work for Acadia National Park, and it would be fun to partner with the National Park City someday, similar to the Sister City model.
Awesome. Sounds brilliant. Thank you. Great. Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure chatting to you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. Great webinar.
Thank you. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Paige. Bye-bye.